Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to the second instalment in my guide to Victorian authors. If you need to catch up on this series, I will link down below the introduction to this series where I talk about kind of the premise of this series, and I'll also link down below yesterday's video where we talked about authors from Abbott to the Brontes. Today we're going to be talking about authors from Bulwer-Lytton to Dickens and many in between. So, having called this video Bulwer-Lytton to Dickens, we're actually going to start with Emma Frances Brooke. I wanted to name all the videos after relatively well-known authors, but obviously I couldn't split my author list always between two very well-known authors. So, we're just gonna call this video Bulwer-Lytton to Dickens, even though we're gonna start three authors before Bulwer-Lytton. Anyway, it's fine. Nobody minds except me. Emma Frances Brooke was born in 1844 and died in 1926. She was a mill owner's daughter from Cheshire, and she was part of the New Woman movement involved in fighting for women's suffrage. I have not read anything by her so far, but I really want to. And the book that I've heard great things about is A Superfluous Woman from 1894. Apparently, male critics at the time said it was a truly immoral book, which is the kind of thing that always makes you want to read a Victorian novel. This is her most famous novel, and it apparently deals with the position of women within marriage. I'm also quite interested to read her 1887 novel, The Heir Without a Heritage, which I don't know much about, but I just quite like the title, and I always love a Victorian inheritance novel, so I feel like that one might be for me as well. The next author I want to talk about is Rhoda Broughton. She was born in North Wales in 1840 and died in 1920, and she wrote over 20 novels, chiefly kind of on the edge of the sensation fiction genre. Rhoda Broughton wasn't necessarily a full sensation writer, but she was sort of broadly in that camp, and she was kind of known for pushing the boundaries of the themes within her novels, which is something that really intrigues me. She was quite well connected in terms of the literary world. She was a niece of J. Sheridan Le Fanu, who we'll be talking about later in the week, and also a friend of Henry James, who again we'll be talking about later in the week. So I have only read one thing by Rhoda Broughton, and that is a collection of short stories of hers from 1873 called The Twilight Stories, or Tales for Christmas Eve. This is a collection of ghost stories that I really liked, but I don't remember them that well, and I read them quite a few years ago. I definitely need to read more by her, and I'm really keen to read some of her more kind of sensation fiction. So a few I've got kind of on my radar are Cometh Up as a Flower from 1867, but I also really want to read Dear Faustina from 1897, which apparently has a lot of homoeroticism in it and was therefore quite scandalous at the time. I'm also kind of curious to read The Game and the Candle from 1899, which apparently is a bit of a persuasion retelling, so that sounds really interesting. I'm really looking forward to discovering more of Rhoda Broughton's work in the future. The next author I want to talk about is Robert Browning, a famous poet who was born in 1812 and died in 1889. I spoke a little bit about Robert Browning yesterday in the context of his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was also a very, very famous poet. In fact, she was quite a lot more successful than Robert Browning during the Victorian period. I know I told the story yesterday, but I will tell it again because I think it's excellent. Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett first met when Robert Browning read some of Elizabeth Barrett's poetry and loved it so much that he wrote her a letter in which he basically said, "I love your poetry so much that I love you too." And then they met up and, fell in love, got married despite a lot of opposition from her family. They were both really fond of Italy and ended up spending a lot of time there together. He outlived her by quite a long time, which I think from what you can gather about their relationship must have been very hard for him. As I said, he was in general kind of quite a bit less successful than his wife, and he kind of only became successful as a poet later on in his life, and actually a lot of his success kind of came after his death. He's now very well respected. I don't think you would necessarily know now that Elizabeth Barrett was so much more successful in her day than Robert Browning was. He is kind of best known for his sort of long dramatic monologue poems, where he takes a character and speaks at length from their perspective. So probably two of the most famous are Fra Lippo Lippi and My Last Duchess. My Last Duchess is a fantastic poem. I would really, really recommend reading that one. I think that's a great kind of place to begin with Robert Browning, and I think that's a fantastic poem. I read quite a few of his poems, of which my favourite would be My Last Duchess, and I've also read his novel in verse, The Ring and the Book from 1869, which is a kind of historical fiction novel told in verse about an Italian murder trial. I really liked it. I kind of thought it was great and really fascinating, but it is quite tough going. I listened to The Ring and the Book on audiobook, which I think definitely helped, but I still did find it quite a tough read, and there were definitely some sections of it that I really struggle to understand. You know, I think if you want to read a novel in verse from the Victorian period, then Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh is a lot more accessible than The Ring and the Book. But I did find it really interesting and I would recommend it. I'm quite keen to read more by Robert Browning. I'd like to read his 1855 collection Men and Women in full. I've definitely read some poems from that, but I haven't read it all. And I would like to, in general, read more by him because I do think he's a great poet. Next, I want to mention Edward Bulwer-Lytton. He was born in 1803 and died in 1873. Just to explain his name before I tell you about Edward Bulwer-Lytton, because sometimes you will see his name given as Edward Bulwer-Lytton and sometimes as Edward Bulwer. So basically, his first name was Edward, his surname was Bulwer. He was born as Edward Bulwer, and Lytton was his mother's maiden name. But he was made a peer, made a baron in 1866, and his title as a baron was Lytton. He was, I think, Baron Lytton of Nebworth. So after 1866, if you were to meet him at a dinner party, you would have addressed him as Lord Lytton, and he would have been known as Lord Lytton. But because he was very famous as an author under the name Edward Bulwer, rather than his books being published under the name Lord Lytton, they were often published as Edward Bulwer-Lytton. Edward Bulwer-Lytton came from an upper-class family in Norfolk, and he had a very privileged upbringing, but then he decided to marry an Irish woman who his family did not approve of, so he was disinherited, had to work for a living, and decided to turn to writing and also to politics. So as well as being a successful novelist, he was also a politician, first for the Whig Party and then later for the Conservatives. He was also a poet as well. In fact, he kind of began with poetry. So his first poetry collection was published in 1820, and then his first novel in 1827. So, you know, he was writing before the Victorian period, but he continued to write a lot of novels in the decade before the Victorian period and throughout the Victorian period up until his death. I have only read one of his novels, Night and Morning from 1841, which I read last year and really, really enjoyed. So I'm definitely keen to read more by him. Having only read one book by him, I would say that Night and Morning is a really great book and a pretty decent place to start with Bulwer-Lytton. Like, it's very accessible and it is very Dickensian, I would say. Like, it is a coming of age story about this young boy who's been disinherited and has to, you know, fend for himself. So I definitely recommend that one. And then there are quite a few more that I'm keen to read. One that I'm very keen to read, which is probably top of my list by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, is a novel called Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, which was originally published just as The Coming Race, but is now usually published as Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. Although I think it has also sometimes been published as The New Utopia, so it has a lot of different titles. But anyway, this is a science fiction novel from 1871 about a man who discovers a race of angelic superhumans living beneath the Earth's surface. So doesn't that sound fascinating? It feels like Bulwer-Lytton's literary output was really varied in genre, which is quite exciting. I'd also be quite keen to read some of his historical fiction. I'm interested in Harold, the Last of the Saxons from 1848. And then apparently he also wrote some like supernatural occult stuff, such as his novel Zanoni from 1842. And he wrote quite a lot of other kind of more realist novels like Night and Morning. So I just feel like I have a long way to go in my Edward Bulwer-Lytton journey, and I'm really excited to read some more by him. Next, I want to talk about Frances Hodgson Burnett. She was born in 1849 and died in 1924, and she's often thought of more as a 20th century writer, but she did start her writing career in the Victorian period. She was born in Manchester, grew up in Manchester, but ended up moving to the US when she was about 16 years old. Later on in life, she returned to England, and she kind of moved between the two quite a lot throughout her life, so she would kind of count both as an American and a British author, I would say. Some of her books are set in the US, but quite a few are also set in Britain. She wrote books both for children and for adults, and she was very prolific. She is best known for some of her novels that came out in the early 20th century, especially The Little Princess and The Secret Garden. But as I said, she did also publish quite a few books during the Victorian period, including Little Lord Fauntleroy and The Making of a Marchioness. So I have actually only read her books from the 20th century. I've only read The Secret Garden which I read a lot as a child. I had the audiobook on tape and I used to listen to it a lot. I think I also read The Little Princess as a child, but I don't remember it at all. There are quite a few of her books that I am curious to read. I'd really like to read her novel The Making of a Marchioness from 1901, which is a kind of Cinderella story about a lower class woman who marries a marquis. And then she also wrote some historical fiction, and I'd be quite interested to read A Lady of Quality from 1896, which is set in 1690 and follows the neglected daughter of a baronet. So that sounds really interesting too. The next author I want to mention is Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler was born in 1835 and died in 1902. He was a novelist and a critic from Nottinghamshire. He also moved to New Zealand when he was a young man, although after 5 years he came back to England. There has been quite a lot of speculation that Samuel Butler was gay, although, you know, it's quite hard to assign sexualities to people from the past because we don't really know how they would have understood their own sexuality at the time, and also, you know, we don't necessarily know that much about their lives. But he definitely had a lot of very close male friendships, including with a man called Henry Festing Jones, who gave up his work as a lawyer in order to become Butler's personal secretary and travelling companion, which definitely sounds like quite a lot of dedication and attachment between them. Butler is best known for his utopian satirical novel Erewhon, which came out in 1872, and also its sequel Erewhon Revisited from 1901. He also wrote some autobiographical fiction, some non-fiction, some travel writing, some art and literary criticism, and he also wrote quite a lot of books about evolution, which I found fascinating. So he was really interested in Darwin, but also quite critical of Darwin, and apparently he believed in evolution but not in natural selection. He wrote a non-fiction book called Evolution Old and New, where he basically criticised Darwin for not paying due credit to all of the other people who kind of came before Darwin who had theories relating to evolution. So I thought that was a really fascinating part of Butler's life and kind of writing career as well. So as I said, the only book I've read by him is Erewhon, which I did find really interesting. This is a science fiction slash fantasy utopian novel from 1872. It doesn't have much of a plot. It is very much you know, a man goes traveling and then discovers this unknown land and proceeds to tell you about all of the different elements of this unknown land as though he were writing non-fiction travel writing, but obviously the world doesn't really exist. In general, I just found it a very interesting read, but not necessarily that much of an enjoyable read. I would like to read some more by Samuel Butler. I am quite interested to read his autobiographical novel, The Way of All Flesh. So this was published in 1903 after Butler's death, but it was written in the 1870s and 1880s, and it was basically a novel about how suffocating his family were. So I'm kind of interested to read that. It's meant to be very, very good. The next author I want to talk about is Mona Caird. Some of her early work was published under the pseudonym G. Noel Hatton, but the majority of her work was published under Mona Caird. She was a novelist and essayist, born in the Isle of Wight, although she later spent a lot of her life both in Scotland and in London. She was part of the New Woman movement, advocating for women's rights and for women's suffrage, and she also campaigned for animal rights and against animal cruelty. She wrote 7 novels and a lot of short stories and essays, as well as 1 travel book, and she's an author who I've read 1 book by and definitely want to explore a lot more from. So I read her novel A Romance of the Moors from 1891 last year. It is a fairly accessible, short love triangle novel where one of the love interests is a kind of new woman figure who's an artist who's very independent and tries to encourage the kind of other people she meets to be more independent. I really liked it. I don't think it's a bad place to start with her work at all. But from what I've heard about her other novels, I feel like A Romance of the Moors is probably like one of her more simpler stories, and I feel like maybe some of her other novels are going to be even more exciting and even more rewarding. I have also read 1 short story by her, The Yellow Drawing Room from 1892, which I really loved. I thought that was fantastic. So actually that's a great place to start with her too, and it's very short. So she wrote quite a few novels, and there are 2 which are especially high on my list. So one is The Wing of Azrael from 1889, which is a new woman novel but also a gothic novel, and apparently it deals with some very serious themes in terms of abuse within marriage, and I really want to read that one. I've heard great things. I'm also very keen to read The Daughters of Danas from 1894, which is a novel about a young woman aspiring to be a musician, so that sounds really interesting. And I'd also be quite keen to read some of her non-fiction. She's got a collection of essays from 1897 called The Morality of Marriage and Other Essays on the Status and Destiny of Women, and I feel like that will be a really fascinating read for me as someone who's very interested in women's history and kind of like the history of early feminist movements in the 1890s, 1900s. So at some point I need to get to that. The next author I want to talk about is Thomas Carlyle. He was born in 1795 and died in 1881, and he was a very, very significant non-fiction writer of the Victorian period. So he was born in Scotland, but lived a lot of his life in London, where he wrote history books, works of social criticism, essays. Like he was very much a kind of general man of letters, as they used to call it in the Victorian period. He was very, very well respected within the Victorian period as an intellectual and a non-fiction writer. He was very much one of the kind of leading figures within non-fiction in the Victorian period. But I think it's fair to say that his legacy is complicated. He's well known for being very racist. He opposed the abolition of slavery. He was notoriously anti-Semitic and anti-Irish. And, you know, I think we all expect Victorians to have views that were very of their time, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of Thomas Carlyle's views were before his time and were on the kind of like extreme end of intolerance for the Victorian period. He wrote a lot of social criticism, so his views and his prejudices are very bound up with his writing. So that is definitely worth being aware of. As I said, he's best known for his non-fiction, although he did write a little bit of fiction, most notably a novel called Sartor Resartus from 1834, so just before the Victorian period. I think he's kind of best known for his history books, books like The French Revolution, a history, the history of Frederick II of Prussia, and he also published and edited a kind of annotated version of the speeches and letters of Oliver Cromwell. So I have read a little bit of Thomas Carlyle. Specifically, I have read the whole of The French Revolution, a history, his big history book from 1837. I actually studied this at university in a module on the legacy and history of the French Revolution, kind of looking at historiography around the French Revolution. And I wrote an essay on like the Victorian understanding of the French Revolution, where I looked at Thomas Carlyle's French Revolution and Charles Dickens's novel A Tale of Two Cities, and kind of looked at how the Victorians understood the French Revolution, which was really, really fascinating to study. It was also really interesting to read Carlyle's history of the French Revolution, because that was a massive influence on A Tale of Two Cities, and you can really see in A Tale of Two Cities that a lot of the way Dickens understands and views the French Revolution comes from Carlyle's book. I've also read quite a few other bits and pieces by Carlyle. Basically, I just read quite a lot of like extracts from his essays and books when I was studying Victorian history at university. I think he is an author who gets looked at kind of in a historical context much more than in a literary context, if that makes sense. And to be honest, my general feeling about the Carlyle that I've read is that it was really interesting to read from a historical perspective, but not from another perspective, really. So I don't have a particular desire to read much else by Carlyle, but I am sure that I will probably read something by him at some point in the future from a kind of like historical research perspective. The next author I want to talk about is Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll is the pen name for Charles Dodson. He was born in Cheshire in 1832 and died in 1898. He was a mathematician, a clergyman, a photographer, a poet and a novelist, and he chiefly wrote children's literature and nonsense poetry. He was also a good friend of George MacDonald, who we'll talk about later this week, who was another Victorian author who wrote a lot for children. George MacDonald was kind of Lewis Carroll's mentor, and he read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland before it was published and kind of encouraged Lewis Carroll to get it published. I think it's fair to say that Lewis Carroll is also an author with a complicated legacy. There has been quite a lot of concern attached to Lewis Carroll's legacy, especially in terms of his close friendships with young girls and his photography of children. Obviously, Lewis Carroll is most famous for his two books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from 1865 and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There from 1871, both of which follow a young girl called Alice and her adventures in a strange land called Wonderland. I really enjoyed both of these books. They are good, fun nonsense that are oddly dark in places. They're really weird, like they are super weird books, but there is something about them that is really kind of compelling and fascinating. There is one other thing I'd be kind of interested to read by Lewis Carroll. So 30 years after Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, he decided to try again to kind of make a literary comeback, and he wrote a book called Sylvie and Bruno in 1895, which is meant to be like a weird combination of a fairy tale and a social critique novel, which sounds kind of interesting, and is apparently about two twin siblings who I think are fairies. It didn't do very well when it came out, and it's been largely forgotten, but I would be kind of curious to read it. The next author I want to talk about is Mary Cholmondeley, and yes, you may be thinking that the name that has appeared on the screen beneath me doesn't look like you would say it as Cholmondeley, but you do say say it as Cholmondeley, which is slightly ridiculous. Mary Cholmondeley was born in 1859 and died in 1925, and she was a novelist and short story writer from Shropshire who is associated with the New Woman movement. She was a friend of Rhoda Broughton, who we've already mentioned, and she published 12 novels, 6 of which were published in the Victorian period. So there is one book by her that I'm really, really keen to read that has been on my radar for ages and ages, and I just haven't read yet, and that is Red Pottage from 1899. This is a novel about 2 friends and their different lives, criticising religious hypocrisy, exploring the themes of female sexuality and women's careers, and I just hear very, very amazing things. This is definitely her most famous novel, but to be honest, I feel like Mary Cholmondeley is the kind of author where once I've read one book by her, I'm going to want to read them all. The next author I want to talk about is Lucy Clifford, whose work is sometimes published under the name Mrs. W.K. Clifford. She was born in London in 1846 and died in 1929, and she was a novelist, a short story writer, a playwright, and a journalist. She wrote quite a lot for adults, but she also wrote stories for children, including her short story collection Anyhow Stories, Moral and Otherwise. What a Victorian title that is. I've read 2 short stories by her, which were bound up in one collection, both of which were kind of children's fairy tales, and those are Wooden Tony and the Wooden Doll, both from 1882, I believe. I didn't love either of these stories, but I did find them both quite interesting, especially Wooden Tony, which is a Victorian fairy tale that's sort of like a reverse Pinocchio. Some modern critics have suggested that they think the character of Tony is meant to be autistic, and I feel like it probably is one of those Victorian short stories that is really academically interesting more than it is enjoyable. However, I would like to give a bit more by Lucy Clifford a try, and there's one of her short stories, Mrs. Keith's Crime, a Record from 1885, which apparently is a short story about euthanasia, which is obviously a very unusual theme for a Victorian story, so I'm quite interested to read that one. The next author I want to talk about is Arthur Hugh Clough. He was a poet from Liverpool, born in 1819 and died in 1861. He had some poems published during his lifetime, but a lot of his poetry was actually published after his death, and his greatest success definitely came after his death. He wasn't very successful during his lifetime. He writes about a lot of kind of similar themes to poets like Matthew Arnold, you know, a lot of social critique themes and skepticism about religion. He also had quite a lot of interesting other Victorian connections. So he was good friends with Matthew Arnold, and he also worked as a secretary to Florence Nightingale, who was his wife's cousin. So that's kind of fascinating, isn't it? I've read quite a few of his poems in kind of anthologies and collections, but I don't remember feeling very strongly about them either way. I feel like none of them have hugely stayed with me, so I definitely need to give him more of a try. I would be quite interested to read his novel in verse, Amours de Voyage, from 1849, because I've read a couple of Victorian novels in verse now and found them really interesting, so I might give that a go sometime. The next author I want to talk about is the wonderful Wilkie Collins. So Wilkie Collins was born in London in 1824 and he died in 1889. He was a sensation writer, and he is one of the really key figures of the kind of sensation genre. He and Mary Elizabeth Braddon are probably the kind of 2 biggest names writing sensation fiction in the Victorian period. He's also considered to be a really important figure in the kind of creation of the detective novel as a genre. Wilkie Collins also had a relatively unusual life. He was very critical of the institution of marriage, both within his life and often within his books, and I guess today we would say that he was polyamorous. So Wilkie Collins had 2 long-term partners. He was in relationships with both of them at the same time, or at least there was a lot of crossover in his relationships with them. He wasn't married to either of those women, and both of them knew about the other and didn't seem to mind that much, and both of them sometimes went off and had relationships with other men, and Wilkie Collins didn't seem to mind either. So a very kind of unusual romantic relationship set up for the Victorian period. Another interesting element of Wilkie Collins's life is that he was a very close friend of Charles Dickens. They were lifelong friends. Charles Dickens was about 12 years older than Wilkie Collins, I think, and he was a bit of a mentor figure. A lot of Wilkie Collins' novels were serialized in Dickens's magazines, and they also wrote collaboratively on some plays, some kind of interconnected short story collections. On his own, Wilkie Collins wrote, I think, 23 novels, as well as a lot of short stories and other bits and pieces. I think Wilkie Collins is a really wonderful writer. I have read 13 and a half of his books, by which I mean I've finished 13 and I'm halfway through one as I film this video, which I should finish very soon. And I guess then, yeah, once I've finished reading Jezebel's Daughter, which I'm reading at the moment, I think I have 9 of his books left, and I definitely want to read all of his novels. He is a bit of a hit or miss author for me. The novels by him that I love, I absolutely love, but there have been a few of his novels that I've absolutely hated. But I feel like because his novels vary so much for me, I kind of have to read them all to make sure I read all the ones that I'm going to love. And even for the books by him that I haven't liked, usually it's been like a thematic or a plot element that I've hated, but I've always loved his writing style. I have made a video talking about Wilkie Collins in a lot more detail, and I'll leave that link down below. But very quickly in this video, I'll give you a very speedy ranking of the 13 books by him that I've finished. The books by him that I don't like very much are The Two Destinies, Basil, and Hide and Seek, with The Two Destinies being my least favourite by quite a long way. Then in the kind of middle section for me would be A Rogue's Life, The Dead Secret, and No Name, which I thought were kind of decent but not the best, though I kind of think I need to reread No Name. Then I really liked The Lord and the Lady and Poor Miss Finch, and then my top 4 would be The Woman in White at number 4, Armadale at number 3, Man and Wife at number 2, and The Moonstone at number 1. I would say that the best place to start with Wilkie Collins is probably The Moonstone. I do think it's his best. I love it. I think it's fantastic. And I also think it gets into the story faster than some of his other amazing books. Like, I love Man and Wife. I think it's fantastic. And once it gets going, it is so good and so tense. But it has a quite long, lengthy prologue, and you have to get through like a lot of preamble before you really get into the novel. Another option could be to start with one of his shorter books, such as A Rogue's Life or Jezebel's Daughter, although, you know, take my recommendation of Jezebel's Daughter with a pinch of salt because I haven't yet finished it. But I feel like those books, they're less impressive and exciting than something like The Moonstone or Man and Wife or Armadale, but they are a lot shorter and therefore might feel a bit more approachable. As I said, I have 9 more books left to read once I finish Jezebel's Daughter, and I do want to read them all. I think top of my list is probably The Evil Genius from 1886, which I've heard very good things about, and also I just love that title. But I definitely want to read them all at some point. The next author I want to talk about is Joseph Conrad. He was born in 1857 and died in 1924. He was of Polish descent, born in what is now Ukraine, what was then part of the Russian Empire, but he moved to England later on in life after a very tempestuous and dramatic childhood and youth. I feel like I don't have time to go into Joseph Conrad's life today, but I was reading about it and it was fascinating. His father was exiled to North Russia when he was a young child, so him and his mother went with his father. And then he ended up being educated in both France and Switzerland, and then working in the French Navy for ages, and then he ended up settling in England and working for the British Navy for a really long time, and then later becoming a British citizen. Joseph Conrad started writing later on in his life, and although his career kind of started in the Victorian period, he is probably better known as a 20th century writer and often thought of as kind of one of the early modernists. But although he's better known as a 20th century writer, 5 of his novels and one of his short story collections were published during the Victorian period. So I think it's fair to claim him as a Victorian author. So I've read only one book by Joseph Conrad, which was Heart of Darkness from 1899. This is a novella set in the Congo, and it is a critique of imperialism, specifically Belgian imperialism here. And I think it's a really interesting read and one to go into bearing in mind the historical context. It's one of those Victorian works that is both exceptionally critical of imperialism and is setting out to be a critique of imperialism, but also there are a lot of imperialist and prejudiced views kind of implicit within the novel itself. I would like to read some more of his fiction. I think he's probably one of those authors that I'm more like academically interested in than expecting to really love his books. But I'd be interested to read his first novel, Alma's Folly, from 1895, and also his 1900 novel, Lord Jim. The next author I want to mention is Marie Corelli. This name was a pseudonym. Her real name was Mary Mackay. She was a novelist from London who was born in 1885 and died in 1924. And she was very commercially successful during the Victorian period, but the critics were unimpressed. She was not highly regarded at all, and she has been fairly forgotten since. She was a bit of a spiritualist, and she often wrote about like mysticism and spiritualism and astral projection and that kind of thing. She also lived for 40 years with her companion Bertha Viver, and there has been some speculation that they were in a romantic relationship, although as I already said in the case of Samuel Butler, it's really hard to know these things for certain. Marie Corelli published 14 novels during the Victorian period, along with some short stories, and then because she obviously lived beyond the end of the Victorian period, she carried on writing and wrote another 11 novels in the early 20th century. So I've heard really good things about her novel Thelma, which is primarily a novel about a Norwegian woman and an English baronet. But I'm also intrigued by her novel A Romance of Two Worlds, which is her first book, and apparently that's very speculative and supernatural and has like some science fiction elements, so I'm quite curious about that one too. The next author I want to talk about is the wonderful Dinah Mulock Craik. Craik was her married name, Mulock was her maiden name, but she is often published just as Dinah Craik, so I thought I would catalogue her under Craik for this video. She was born in Staffordshire in 1836 and died in 1887. She's best known for her domestic realist novels for adults, although she also wrote some short stories and fairy stories for children. She wrote 20 novels during her lifetime, as well as a lot of shorter works. Her novels deal with a lot of interesting themes, but one theme that you often see in her novels is disability and chronic illness, and she looked at disability and chronic illness in a really interesting way that was in many ways, I think, very ahead of its time. So if you're interested in disability in Victorian literature, which is one of my kind of academic interests, I suppose, then Dinah Mulock Craik is definitely an author you must read. So I've read 3 of her novels and some shorter works, and I really, really like her books a lot. I've read Olive from 1850, which is a wonderful coming-of-age story about a young girl, Olive, who's born with scoliosis. She's told from a really young age that because she doesn't look like other children, like other girls, she's not going to get married, she's not going to have children, so she becomes an artist and does something different with her life. And this book is a sort of wonderful coming-of-age story, Bildungsroman, you know, in the style of something like Jane Eyre or David Copperfield, but it also deals with the prejudice that Olive faces, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful novel. This is definitely where I'd recommend starting with Dinah Mulock Craik. I think it's fantastic. I've read 2 other novels by her, John Halifax Gentleman from 1856 and A Noble Life from 1866, both of which I really liked, but not as much as Olive. And I've read some of her shorter works as well. I definitely want to read more by her. I think she's another of those Victorian authors that I would like to read everything by one day. The few that are top of my list are probably Agatha's Husband from 1853, A Life for a Life from 1859, which apparently begins with a murder, so that sounds quite different for a Dinah Mulock Craik novel. And then I'm also quite interested to read her children's fairy tale, The Little Lame Prince and His Travelling Cloak from 1875. As I said, Dinah Mulock Craik is an author who looks at disability in really interesting and complex ways within her books, and I've heard good things about this children's short story. The next author I want to mention is Victoria Cross. This was obviously a pen name inspired by the medal, the Victoria Cross. Her real name was Annie Sophie Corey, and she's sometimes also published under the names Vivian Corey or V.C. Griffin. She was born in 1868 and died in 1952. She was born in what is now Pakistan. Her father was in the British Army there, and they returned to England when she was a teenager. She was part of the New Woman movement, and her novels were very controversial at the time, especially because her novels look a lot at female sexuality, at interracial relationships, and kind of subverts traditional gender roles quite a lot. So doesn't she sound like an interesting subversive figure who I definitely need to read something by? So she wrote 4 books during the Victorian period and then went on to write a lot more during the 20th century. So there are a lot of things by her that I want to read. Top of my list is probably The Woman Who Didn't from 1895, which was written as a response to Grant Allen's novel The Woman Who Did, which I spoke about yesterday. And I found The Woman Who Did really interesting, but I didn't love everything about it, and I think I'd be fascinating to read a kind of critique of The Woman Who Did. And then I'm also very interested to read Anna Lombard from 1901, which is a novel about a married English woman who has a love affair with an Indian man. Big novel from 1901, maybe that won't be handled well, but on the other hand, Victoria Cross was very criticised at the time for her very positive depiction of interracial relationships. So I'm kind of interested to read that as well. The next author I want to talk about is Catherine Crowe, who was a novelist and a playwright. She was born in Kent in 1790 and died in 1872, and she wrote both for adults and children, both realist works and supernatural things. She wrote 2 plays and quite a lot of novels, the most successful of which was The Adventures of Susan Hopley from 1847, which was very popular, partly because it was adapted into a play that was very successful in the Victorian period. I haven't read anything by Crowe before, but I would like to. I'd be curious to read her melodrama, The Cruel Kindness from 1853, because I do enjoy a Victorian melodrama. And I'd also love to read the story of Lily Dawson, which is a story of a young girl who is shipwrecked and kidnapped by smugglers and then runs into some pirates. It sounds totally wild, so I kind of want to read that one. When I was looking into her work, I found one of her children's books, which I'm not sure that I necessarily want to read, but I just really enjoyed the title. It is Pippi's Warning or Mind Your Temper from 1848. What a Victorian title is that? The next author I want to talk about is Ella D'Arcy, who is a late 19th century, early 20th century short story writer. She was born in London in 1857 and died in 1937, and she was part of the New Woman movement. She was one of the editors of a journal called The Yellow Book, which is kind of the main journal sort of associated with the group of proto-feminist, feminist writers who are often referred to as New Woman writers. She published short stories in that journal as well as in many others, and she also translated non-fiction from French to English. I would be really keen to read some of her short fiction, specifically I think Monochromes, her first short story collection, I'd be very interested in. In general, I'm very interested in women's rights movements of the 1880s, 1890s, so I'm definitely going to read something by Ella D'Arcy at some point in the future. The next writer I want to talk about is Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809 in Shropshire and died in 1882. Obviously, Darwin is pretty famous. He was a very significant scientist and biologist from the Victorian period, best known for his theory of evolution and natural selection. His theories were hugely influential within the Victorian period and beyond, and he is probably like one of the most significant scientific writers and thinkers ever, I guess. He wrote a lot of non-fiction and scientific works, and he is best known, of course, for his book from 1859 on the origin of species by means of natural selection, but he also wrote a lot of other non-fiction articles and books. I've read extracts from On the Origin of Species, and I also read quite a lot of extracts from his letters when I was studying Victorian history at university, which was really fascinating. I think especially in terms of like the clash in his mindset between his theory of evolution and religion. Like, that was really interesting to look at through his letters. I'm not a very scientific person, and I'm not like super excited by biology as a subject, so I don't imagine that I'm going to read a lot of Charles Darwin in my life, but he is obviously a very significant Victorian non-fiction writer, so I did want to mention him today. The next writer I want to mention is Mary de Morgan. She was born in London in 1850 and died in 1907, and she wrote 3 collections of literary fairy tales that apparently have quite like feminist and socialist themes, so that sounds really interesting. She was again a late Victorian feminist. She was a member of the women's suffrage group called the Women's Franchise League. She was also a friend of William Morris's, so that's interesting. And yeah, I really want to read her fairy tales. They sound great. I'm especially pulled towards The Wind Fairies from 1900. I'm not entirely sure why. I think maybe it's because the title makes me think of the Flower Fairies, and I really enjoyed the Flower Fairies as a kid. And then finally, the last author I want to talk about in this video is the amazing Charles Dickens. I have far too many books of his to hold up them all. He was one of the most successful authors of the Victorian period. He was hugely famous and hugely popular. He used to go on reading tours where he would like go to theatres and town halls and read the like greatest hits extracts from his novels, like read everyone's favorite chapters to massive applause, like he was a rock star doing his best songs. I think that's so cool. Many people have said that Charles Dickens was kind of like one of the first real celebrities. He wrote a lot of pretty long serialized novels featuring a lot of characters. A lot of his books were works of social critique. Sometimes he wrote coming of age stories. He wrote a few historical novels, and as well as writing novels, he also wrote non-fiction and short stories, and was an editor of several literary magazines. He encouraged a lot of other writers, including Wilkie Collins and Elizabeth Gaskell. He also had a fairly tumultuous personal life. His childhood kind of began fairly middle class, but then he was plunged into poverty after his father was sent to debtor's prison. In adulthood, he tried and failed to become an actor, then became a journalist, and through his journalism ended up getting the opportunity to write some comic sketches for a newspaper, and these comic sketches kind of became the novel The Pickwick Papers, which was so hugely successful that it kind of like kick-started serialization as a popular form of publishing within the Victorian period. And following the Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens just became really popular. He married young, had many children, and in a very complicated situation that I don't have time to go in here, ended up separating from his wife and lived the last decade and a half of his life with a younger woman named Ellen Ternan, and that relationship was sort of largely hidden from the public. He wrote 14 full-length novels, plus a half novel he was working on when he died, 5 Christmas novellas, some non-fiction works, lots of short stories, and so many other bits and pieces. He was exceptionally popular throughout his time and continues to be very popular. I think Dickens is probably the most famous Victorian author, and like one of the most famous British authors. I guess like Shakespeare and Jane Austen would be fighting him for the top, but Dickens would be definitely up there. And he is my favourite author. I love Charles Dickens a lot. I have made a lot of videos about Charles Dickens on this channel, so I feel like I shouldn't go on about him for too long here. I'll leave down below my latest ranking of Charles Dickens and a playlist of all the individual videos I've done on his novels. I've read all 14 and a half of his novels many, many times. I've read all his Christmas books a few times. I've read 2 of his non-fiction works and a lot of short stories. We could be here all day with me talking about Dickens. So let me just say my favourite 5 Dickens novels would be number 5, Great Expectations, number 4, Bleak House, number 3, Little Dorrit, number 2, Dombey and Son, and number 1, Our Mutual Friend, my favourite book ever. If you want to know where to start with Charles Dickens, then I would say a good place to start would either be Great Expectations or David Copperfield. These 2 novels are in first person, so although there are still a lot of characters and a lot of plot threads, you have sort of one first person narrator to anchor yourself to, which I think can be really helpful. I think especially Great Expectations is probably a really good place to start with Charles Dickens. And I also do think his novella A Christmas Carol isn't a bad place to start with his books either, because very short, you probably know the story, really delightfully Christmassy, and it's a really good example of his writing style. Like, if you read A Christmas Carol and you really hate his writing style, you're not going to like Dickens, and it might be useful for you to know that from just reading a short book. I have read a lot by Charles Dickens. I've read all his novels and novellas, but there is still a bit more for me to read. So there's a few more non-fiction books I haven't read. I must read Pictures from Italy sometime, and there's also quite a few short stories I haven't read. There's also a couple of plays he wrote, The Lamplighter, which I haven't read, and he also wrote a play with Wilkie Collins called No Thoroughfare that I haven't read, so I must read that sometime too. And I also want to read more about Dickens. Like, I feel like there's a lot of biographies and non-fiction books out there that I want to read. As I said, Charles Dickens is my favourite author and I love his books a lot. So that feels like a nice place to end this video on. I feel like I've been talking for so long and this video is probably very long, but I have had a lot of very exciting authors to introduce you to today. So I hope this video has been interesting. Do let me know down in the comments, have you read any of these authors? What did you think of them? Do come back tomorrow, where I'm going to be talking about authors from Amy Dilwyn to Elizabeth Gaskell, with many in between. We've got Benjamin Disraeli tomorrow. We've got Arthur Conan Doyle. We've got George Eliot. There's a lot of big hitters tomorrow as well. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow with another bookish video.